Marcus Rodriguez never thought his engineering degree from Terra Prime University would land him shoveling radioactive waste on Kepler 442c. But life had a twisted sense of humor. The Galactic Mining Consortium had promised him a prestigious position designing orbital platforms. Instead, he found himself exiled to the most forsaken corner of known space, all because he'd refused to sign off on faulty safety protocols that would have endangered thousands of workers. The transport ship's engines died with a pathetic whimper as it touched down on the scarred surface of what the locals called the graveyard. Through the porthole, Marcus watched the red-tinged landscape stretch endlessly toward a horizon broken only by the skeletal remains of abandoned mining equipment. The air outside was technically breathable, but barely, thick with dust and chemical residue that made every breath taste like copper and regret. "Welcome to paradise," muttered Elena Vasquez, the geologist sitting across from him. She'd been on the same transport, another troublemaker, shipped off by the consortium after she tried to expose illegal strip mining operations on 3 different worlds. Her dark eyes held the same mixture of anger and determination that Marcus recognized in his own reflection. The other passengers were a collection of the consortium's unwanted. Jacob Thompson, a former security chief who'd refused orders to break up peaceful worker protests. Rebecca Martinez, a communications officer who'd leaked evidence of corporate cover-ups, and dozens of others whose only crime had been maintaining their integrity in a system designed to crush it. The processing station was a collection of prefabricated domes connected by enclosed walkways, all painted the same depressing shade of institutional gray. Administrator Harrison Walsh stood at the entrance, his pristine consortium uniform a stark contrast to the grimy environment around him. He was everything Marcus had learned to despise about corporate authority, soft around the middle, eyes that never quite met yours directly, and a smile that never reached beyond his lips. "Congratulations," Walsh announced as they filed past him. "You've all earned yourselves a 5-year contract in waste reclamation. Your quarters are assigned, your work schedules are posted, and your communication privileges are suspended pending review of your loyalty status." He paused, that false smile widening. Of course, exemplary service and proper attitude adjustments might reduce that time frame considerably. Marcus's jaw clenched. Even here, thousands of light years from civilization, they expected submission and gratitude for their punishment. But as he looked around at his fellow exiles, he saw something Walsh had clearly missed. These weren't broken people. They were engineers, scientists, security specialists, and technicians who'd been willing to sacrifice everything for principle. The consortium hadn't just dumped its problems on Kepler 442c. It had accidentally created the most qualified group of rebels in the galaxy. The work was brutal by design. Marcus found himself assigned to the thermal processing plant, where industrial waste from 17 different worlds was broken down into component materials. The heat was oppressive, the protective equipment deliberately inadequate, and the quotas impossibly high. It was meant to break them, to transform proud professionals into compliant drones grateful for any scrap of corporate mercy. But Marcus had always been good with systems, and within weeks he began to notice inefficiencies that weren't accidental. The power grid was intentionally overloaded during peak hours, causing regular brownouts that reduced productivity and created dangerous working conditions. The water recycling system had been modified to operate at barely 60% efficiency, ensuring chronic shortages that kept workers focused on survival rather than resistance. Even the communication array had been deliberately limited, preventing any coordination between work groups. During his second month, Marcus made contact with Alina during one of the carefully monitored meal periods. They communicated through a simple code based on maintenance reports, something that would seem mundane to casual observation, but could convey complex technical information. Through these exchanges, he learned that similar sabotage existed throughout the facility. The consortium wasn't just punishing them, it was conducting a systematic experiment in human degradation. The breaking point came when David Kim, a 43-year-old environmental scientist, collapsed during his shift at the chemical separation facility. The medical bay was understaffed and under-equipped, part of the facility's deliberate inadequacy. Marcus watched helplessly as David struggled to breathe, his lungs damaged by exposure to inadequately filtered toxins. Administrator Walsh's response was to dock everyone's meal rations for failure to maintain safety protocols, despite the fact that the safety equipment they'd been given was decades old and barely functional. That night, as David fought for his life in the medical bay's single-functioning bed, Marcus made his decision. He slipped out of his assigned quarters and made his way through the facility's maintenance tunnels, pathways he'd mapped during his weeks of careful observation. The others were waiting. Alina with her geological surveys that revealed the facility's structural vulnerabilities, Jacob with his knowledge of security protocols, Rebecca with her understanding of the communication systems, and a dozen others who'd been quietly preparing for this moment. They gathered in an abandoned storage bay, the only space large enough for their group, and shielded from the facility's surveillance network. Marcus spread out the technical diagrams he'd been secretly preparing, modifications that could transform their prison into something unprecedented. The facility sat atop one of the richest rare earth deposits in the galaxy, resources the consortium had been too focused on punishment to properly exploit. With the right modifications, they could turn the waste processing plant into the most efficient mining and refining operation in 3 sectors. "We're not escaping," Marcus explained to the assembled group. "We're taking over. The consortium thinks they've buried us, but they've actually given us everything we need to build our own kingdom." The plan was audacious in its scope and brilliant in its simplicity. The facility's waste processing systems could be modified to extract valuable materials from the industrial refuse they'd been sentenced to handle. The thermal plant could be converted into a smelting operation. The communication array, once properly configured, could reach black market traders in the outer rim systems. And the facility's isolated location, meant to keep them cut off from civilization, would actually protect them from consortium interference once they were self-sufficient. But first, they had to deal with Administrator Walsh and his handful of loyal guards. This required a more subtle approach than direct confrontation. Marcus had noticed that Walsh had a weakness for the imported alcohol he kept in his private quarters, a luxury that violated the facility's official policies. Over the course of several weeks, Elena used her access to the geological lab to synthesize a compound that would interact with alcohol to cause severe but temporary neurological symptoms. Nothing permanent, but enough to incapacitate him for several crucial days. The takeover began at 300 during the night shift, when the facility's skeleton crew made surveillance easier to avoid. Rebecca had already gained control of the communication systems, cutting off Walsh's ability to contact the consortium while maintaining the appearance of normal operations. Jacob and his team secured the armory and detained the guards, using their knowledge of security protocols to neutralize resistance without violence. Marcus and Elena led teams to secure the critical systems, power, life support, and the industrial equipment they would need for their transformation. Administrator Walsh didn't realize what had happened until he woke up 3 days later in the medical bay, his temporary neurological symptoms finally clearing. By then, the facility had been completely transformed. The waste processing plant was already showing promising yields of rare earth elements. The communication array was in contact with traders who were eager to purchase materials at prices far above consortium standard rates. And most importantly, the exiles had organized themselves into a functional community with skills that complemented each other perfectly. "You people have no idea what you've done," Walsh sputtered when Marcus visited his makeshift cell in the former disciplinary quarters. "The consortium will send a fleet. They'll turn this entire facility into radioactive glass before they let you get away with this." Marcus smiled, the expression holding none of Walsh's false warmth but all of his own genuine satisfaction. "That's the beauty of it, Harrison. We're not getting away with anything. We're making this place profitable. Do you know what the consortium values more than obedience? Money. And we're about to make them more money from this facility than they ever dreamed possible." The truth was more complex than Marcus let on. He knew the consortium would eventually send investigators, and they had to be ready for that confrontation. But he also understood corporate psychology better than Walsh gave him credit for. The consortium had written off Kepler 442c as a loss, a convenient dumping ground for personnel problems. If that dumping ground suddenly became profitable, they would face a choice between expensive military action and lucrative partnership. Over the following months, the facility underwent a complete transformation. The living quarters were expanded and improved using materials extracted from their own operations. The medical bay was equipped with proper facilities using trade goods acquired through their new commercial relationships. The work schedules were reorganized around productivity rather than punishment, and the artificial scarcities that had kept them desperate were eliminated. Marcus found himself emerging as the settlement's unofficial leader, not through force or politics, but through the simple fact that his technical expertise had made their revolution possible. He coordinated the complex logistics of transforming waste into wealth, managed relationships with the outer rim traders who'd become their economic lifeline, and planned for the inevitable day when the consortium would come calling. That day arrived exactly 11 months after their takeover, when a consortium inspection ship appeared in orbit around Kepler 442c. Marcus watched its approach from the facility's new observation deck, a structure built from the same rare earth alloys they'd been extracting from what was supposed to be worthless waste. Elena stood beside him, along with Jacob, Rebecca, and the other leaders of their new community. "Are you ready for this?" Elena asked, her hand resting on his shoulder. Marcus nodded, thinking of David Kim, who'd recovered completely in their improved medical facilities and was now leading their environmental monitoring team. He thought of the 137 people who'd been thrown away by a system that valued compliance over competence, who'd built something extraordinary from their shared rejection of corporate tyranny. "We've been ready since the day they decided we were disposable," he replied. "Let's show them what the galaxy's rejects can accomplish." The inspection team that landed at their facility bore little resemblance to the punishment detail that had dumped them there nearly a year earlier. These were senior executives and military officials, people accustomed to being treated with deference and respect. They were met instead by a delegation of confident professionals operating a facility that produced higher yields and greater profits than any comparable consortium operation. Director Margaret Foster, the consortium's regional administrator, toured their operations with barely concealed amazement. The waste processing plant was extracting materials at efficiency rates 30% above industry standards. The rare earth mining operation was yielding elements that commanded premium prices in the core worlds. And the entire facility was operating with safety and environmental standards that exceeded corporate minimums, while maintaining profitability that made their quarterly reports look like fantasy. How was all Foster could manage when Marcus finished his presentation in what had once been Administrator Walsh's office. "You gave us the right people and the right motivation," Marcus replied simply. "We just needed the freedom to do what we do best." The negotiations that followed were complex and sometimes heated, but the fundamental mathematics were undeniable. The consortium could attempt to reassert control through military force, spending enormous resources to shut down a profitable operation and eliminate valuable personnel. Or they could recognize the new reality and find a way to profit from it. The agreement they eventually reached transformed Kepler 442c from a penal colony into an autonomous special economic zone. The facility's residents became partners rather than prisoners, sharing in the profits from their operations while maintaining operational independence. Administrator Walsh was quietly transferred to a desk job on a core world, his failure to recognize the potential of his charges becoming a cautionary tale in corporate management circles. Marcus stood once again on the observation deck, but the view had changed dramatically. Where once there had been only barren wasteland and abandoned equipment, now there were expanding settlements, productive mines, and manufacturing facilities that supplied rare earth elements to half the galaxy. Ships arrived daily with trade goods and new volunteers, not exiles, but people who'd heard about their success and wanted to be part of something unprecedented. "Any regrets?" Elena asked, joining him as she had so many times over the past 3 years. Marcus thought about his comfortable apartment on Terra Prime, The prestigious career he'd sacrificed, the conventional life he'd left behind when he'd refused to compromise his principles. Then he looked out at the thriving community they'd built from nothing, at the hundreds of people who'd found purpose and prosperity in what was supposed to be their punishment. "Just one," he said finally. "I wish it hadn't taken them throwing us away for us to realize what we were capable of." The galaxy had indeed thrown them away, discarded them as problems to be hidden rather than resources to be valued. But in their rejection, they'd found something the consortium's corporate structure could never provide: the freedom to build something extraordinary from the pieces they'd been given. The Wastelands had become their kingdom not through conquest, but through the simple recognition that sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is refuse to accept other people's definitions of your worth. As the binary stars set over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Marcus smiled at the poetry of it all. They'd been sent to the most forsaken corner of space as punishment for their integrity. Instead, they'd turned it into the most successful colony in 3 sectors, all while maintaining the very principles that had gotten them exiled in the first place. The consortium had meant to break them, but had instead given them the greatest gift possible: each other, and the freedom to prove that their way of doing things wasn't just morally superior, but more effective. They'd made the Wastelands their kingdom not through force or manipulation, but through competence, cooperation, and an unwavering commitment to doing things right. In the end, that had made all the difference.